Hello, and welcome to episode 136 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Zach Kaufman, Senior Fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and former U.S. Supreme Court Fellow. Zach has published 3 books, including After Genocide, Social Entrepreneurship in the Age of Atrocities, and U.S. Law and Policy on Transitional Justice. Zach, how are you doing today?
I'm well, Jordan. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. The first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
I've been interested in genocide and mass atrocity issues for about 20 years now, and so that's the issue area that I most work in. And I've done so from a number of different vantages. Most recently, I work as an academic, writing and lecturing on these issues, raising public awareness about them through my work, making policy suggestions. And in the past, I've also served in government at the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Department of Justice on these issues, and in 3 international war crimes tribunals. And in addition, I've also been working in nonprofit organizations and social enterprises on these issues as well.
So not every person walking down the streets can say that their career is in genocide studies, as it were. What is it that originally attracted you to this subject area? How does one get involved?
I think it was sort of a confluence of a few different things. First of all, my mother was born in South Africa, and so I was raised from an early age learning about Africa. And she lived through part of the apartheid era, and so I learned early on about discrimination. I also happen to be Jewish, and so I learned about the Holocaust that my people have suffered, and several of my relatives perished in the Holocaust. And so, like with my mother coming from South Africa, again from an early age, I learned about discrimination. Growing up in Morgantown, West Virginia, I personally faced several instances of violent anti-Semitism. And so, I learned the lesson that innocents can sometimes suffer discrimination that can be manifested violently, and that people, even in positions of power, could either be bystanders or might even exacerbate those situations. So fast forward to the time I was in high school, and the Rwandan genocide occurred then in 1994 when I was a sophomore, and the parallels to the Holocaust were so stark and significant. And I just had, kind of a visceral reaction given the experiences that I had gone through, but also that I was raised to be cognizant of. And so I immediately became interested in somehow becoming involved. And that was my early sort of impetus to become personally involved in helping to alleviate and address genocide situations. I then became...
Well, allow me to interject right there. Sure. So in 1994, you were in high school in Pittsburgh, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So there were many individuals in high school in Pittsburgh at the time, correct?
Yes.
But not all of them ended up having quite an interest, personal attachment to genocide. So could you delve a little bit in deeper? You said that you have personal family history with genocide in the past, with apartheid in South Africa, but you said that that because of those reasons, you reacted somewhat differently to news of the Rwanda genocide. How did your friends react? How was that? What was going on in society that you reacted so much stronger?
I mean, unfortunately, there really wasn't much public awareness about the Rwandan genocide. It's really one of the tragedies of it. And I was just sort of unusually primed, I guess, to follow news coming out of Africa, and also news about genocide. And so just, the combination of the two, because of where my mother had come from, and also the Holocaust, again, in my family's background, I think just, put me in a sort of unusual place to be interested.
Interesting. All right. So you ended up going to college, and right then, that's really where you started studying genocide. Is that right?
That's right. Most of my family, or many of them at least, are doctors, and I also went to school, to college, thinking that I would also be sort of pre-med, and then I started precisely because of the Rwandan genocide, taking classes on human rights and political science and sort of pre-law type classes. And that's where really my kind of formative early education on human rights started. And then I also was fortunate enough to get a fellowship to go to study human and minority rights in Europe called Humanity in Action. And the program specialized in was inspired by the Danish rescue of the Jews during the Holocaust. And so, pulls together threads from, World War II, but also contemporary struggles in dealing with human rights violations. And
were you in Europe around the same time that the Srebrenica massacre was happening and the whole Kosovo-Bosnia thing in Southern Europe?
It was about a year later, but of course that was also one of the tragedies that I was studying in college.
Right.
And Srebrenica, of course, is the worst mass atrocity in Europe since World War II and the Holocaust, and the reverberations of which we continue to deal with today.
So you were in Europe and you were studying. Why is it that being pre-law, why is it that getting a law degree, which you subsequently did obtain, why does that better prepare you to, I guess, prevent humanitarian disasters in the future? Why would it be a lawyer? Why not? Or what pathway?
Well, I would suggest that people from all industries could or perhaps should be involved in atrocity prevention and response. We see amazing examples of physicians, for example, through Doctors Without Borders and Physicians for Human Rights, who are involved in these issues, as well as others in technology and engineering and in sociology, psychology, and others. It just seemed to me that my calling was in understanding the legal and political dynamics of mass atrocities, and so that's what I felt called to specialize in.
Interesting. Okay, so you're in Europe, and what were you studying in particular out there?
I was in Denmark, and so the beginning of the program kind of focuses on the Danish rescue of the Jews, a very successful effort to save their Jewish population during World War II. But then it moves through time to the current day to examine minority rights violations in Europe more generally. And of course, today, and since I was there are many instances of such. And so it was really tying together the past to the present.
So, and by the way, when you speak about the Danish incident with the Jews, is that where the king of Denmark said that he would wear the yellow Jewish star when the Nazis came in, and all of his subjects were Danish subjects, and Jewish or not, the Nazis weren't going to take?
That's right. King Christian was very protective of, and successfully so, of the Jewish population, and not only in the way that you mentioned, but also in helping ferry many of them to Sweden, which was neutral territory, so that they would be protected.
So there's all these different massacres happening around the world, and they continue today, and people may debate whether maybe there's Sudan or maybe in the Democratic Republic of Congo or different areas of the world. But all of that is happening elsewhere to people who you've never met, right? You're from West Virginia, you went to high school in Pennsylvania, you live in Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., you're not living in these communities. What is it that where's the empathy come from? What is it that makes you care so much about what's happening to these people in other parts of the world?
It's a great question. It's hard to know exactly what always makes us tick, right? And but I would say actually I have lived in some of these communities. So I've spent quite a lot of time living in and visiting Rwanda, but also neighboring countries as well. And I've worked personally on some of the war crimes investigations and prosecutions when I served at three of the tribunals: the one for Rwanda, the one for former Yugoslavia, and the Permanent International Criminal Court. And all throughout, I've met victims, survivors who have really touched me with their personal stories of what they've endured and emerged from, and those experiences have really stayed with me and further inspire me to remain focused in this field. And like you said, I mean, atrocities persist all around the world in the countries that you mentioned, but also we see Syria, for example, is the probably the biggest humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. And in addition to the African situations that you mentioned, I would also point out in Burma the targeting of the Rohingya with atrocities as well. So we do see these mass atrocities persist, unfortunately, so many places in the world.
So I'd like to ask you at this point for a definition. Many of our listeners may be confused about what a genocide is and the difference between genocide and violence more generally. For instance, I once heard somebody say, well, why be so worried about the genocide of Jews in World War II when there were, a lot of blacks killed in the slave trade? Mm-hmm. Isn't that something worth worrying about? Was that genocide? Was that not genocide? What is genocide, and why is it different than other types of violence?
It's a great question, and legal scholars have been working on this for quite some time. What really is the definition of genocide? And effectively, it is the targeting in whole or in part a particular group for extermination.
So it always is for killing all of the people in a particular group?
Usually, yes. There are other ways that you could affect genocide, but typically the way that we understand it is by killing in whole or in part a particular group. And one of the reasons why it is sometimes known as the crime of crimes is that, and that's a quote from the Rwanda Tribunal, is that the targeting of some people is heinous, of course, but the intentionality of trying to eliminate a whole group is one of the most heinous crimes against humanity we could imagine. And so, you mentioned slavery, yet again, one of the other, worst crimes that we could possibly imagine. But we do need to differentiate, the different types of heinous crimes, just so that we can be specific about them, about their causes, about how they're perpetrated and orchestrated, and about also how we would investigate, prosecute, and punish them.
Would it be appropriate to say that the objective of the slave trade was to make people into property and then to use them for one's own economic advancement? Through the course of these activities, many blacks died. But the end objective was to enrich the slave owners, not to kill all black people. Whereas in a genocide, the objective is death. Whereas in slavery, the objective is economic growth, and a byproduct is death. Would that be inappropriate?
That's right, yes. If the key distinction of genocide is the elimination in whole or in part of the group. Slavery, an equally heinous offense we can imagine, is somewhat different in the ways that you mentioned. Although I would note that some instances of enslavement have included genocide.
Right.
So there has been historically some overlap as well.
So you mentioned that when you've worked in these war crime tribunals, you were able to hear certain stories that resonated with you, that inspired empathy in you. If it's too difficult, then I'd understand. Would you be able to share any of these stories with our listeners to perhaps inspire a similar kind of empathy in them?
Yeah, one of the earliest survivors of the Rwandan genocide that I met was named Ancilla. This is going back to one of my, I think, earliest trips to Rwanda, which was around 2000 or 2001. And what had happened to her just 6 years earlier in 94 was when the genocide erupted in April of 1994, her family, she's Tutsi and her family is Tutsi, was targeted.
And what is Tutsi for our listeners?
Tutsi is the minority ethnic group in Rwanda. Actually, there are two minority ethnic groups, the Twa and the Tutsi, but the genocide was mostly focused on on the Tutsi.
Committed by what was the ethnic group?
The majority ethnic group, which is called the Hutu.
Okay, thank you.
And so Ancilla is targeted, and her family was attacked, and her husband and 2 children were slashed with machetes, as she was as well, and they were all thrown in a pit. And so she was at the bottom of the pit, and her husband and 2 children were piled on top of her and died. She regained consciousness, Lord knows how, and was able to crawl out of the pit and hide in the marshes for the remainder of the genocide. And she remains to this day scarred physically and certainly emotionally by what happens. And here's really one of the most amazing aspects of this story, which is that to this day she lives next door to the person that she accuses of doing this. And so we see in Rwanda these sorts of situations where, in part because the country is so small, but also in part because there are so many people who participated in the genocide and not all have been addressed, that we to this day see some people who live side by side with the people who perpetrated these terrible crimes against them.
So I'd like to use this point to segue into your legal career. You mentioned that she continues to live not next door to the person who did this, the perpetrator of these crimes, but to the person she names as a perpetrator. So there's something called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is a legal body. I'll allow you to speak on that in a moment. And I want you to segue from that into your legal work in America, be it as a law professor teaching future generations of law students, be it at the U.S. Supreme Court, and how legal measures, which is a lot of what your career is about, have been used to thwart future genocides, but also heal from past genocides.
So there's basically a whole range of options that are available to address mass atrocities. Truth commissions are one example that you mentioned. War crimes tribunals would be another, and still there are others as well, like amnesty and exile. My latest book, United States Law and Policy on Transitional Justice, lays out all of these options, some of which are merely theoretical, haven't actually been put into practice, others of which have, of course, been pursued. And it talks about the United States experience, the U.S. government's experience with them, either by being directly involved in them or supporting them or opposing them. Mm-hmm. The Truth Commission, like the one you mentioned, perhaps the most famous example is from South Africa. And actually, coincidentally, the very same year in which Rwanda created its War Crimes Tribunal, 1994, South Africa created its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the most famous such commission that's ever existed. And these are very different approaches. A War Crimes Tribunal is very much retributive, is legalistic, and focuses on bringing perpetrators to justice. A Truth Commission is different. In the case of South Africa, and some Truth Commissions have been a little different, but in the case of South Africa, in exchange for truthful testimony, amnesty or immunity was offered. The idea being that you could incentivize people to literally, for example, tell where the bodies are buried if you promise not to prosecute them. And so over time, truth commissions have been designed in different ways and around the world and have succeeded to different degrees. But a lot of it comes down to what the society thinks is the best way forward, and what is also most likely to promote reconciliation and healing. Some people think that tribunals don't necessarily do that, but their advocates would say that's not necessarily the point anyway. The point is to punish. And truth commissions are sort of viewed as more promoting reconciliation. So we throughout the world, there is really a diversity of approach and opinion as to which of these bodies is more appropriate, and a lot of it also has to do with the circumstance. So, for example, in Rwanda, there was a decisive military defeat of the Hutu extremists, and so those who were victors of that conflict were able to implement whichever type of approach they wanted, and they opted for retributive. In South Africa, there was really a stalemate, and it was a negotiated peace, and so they arguably probably had less of a range of options, a more narrow range of options. And so part of the negotiated peace was that the lead perpetrators would not be prosecuted. So some people think that it's actually partly related to how the conflict ends, that you would have a particular range of options.
And bringing this back to your life, to the life of Zach Kaufman in his legal career, you worked in the Supreme Court. You currently are at Harvard. Can you tell us a little bit about how all these experiences inform your work today?
Certainly. Well, all throughout my travels and the work that I've done in the field, I've always kept a journal of everything I've kind of seen and done and learned. And that really was what sparked my early interest in writing. People kept asking me for stories of, what was happening in the field, and, like what have victims and survivors suffered? Can you actually explain a little bit more in detail? And so I started writing about my experiences, what I'd seen, and also my critiques. Especially when I was working at the three tribunals that I served at, I noticed that they were, not perfect, and that they certainly had a lot of room for improvement. And so a lot of my early work was sort of critiquing and making policy prescriptions about how international legal institutions could improve. That then inspired me to pursue a career in academia, where I could dedicate my time to writing, teaching, and lecturing about mass atrocities, particularly the legal and political issues involved.
Sure. So, were you able? Did any of these? I guess how did your Supreme Court experience? Was that just sharpening your legal mind, or were there any issues related to genocide that came across your desk during that time?
Well, I felt that in order to be effective at my field of specialty, being mass atrocities, I needed to learn about the law generally. And of course, people, when you go to law school, you do exactly that. And there was an opportunity arose later on to serve at the U.S. Supreme Court, where I was focusing on international legal issues and human rights and some other related matters. So I didn't focus exclusively or even primarily on atrocity issues. I was there more to, as you said, sort of hone my legal skills generally, and also to contribute what I could, particularly on international law.
So who did you clerk for? Did you clerk for one particular justice?
It wasn't a clerkship. It was a fellowship, which is a different position. The clerks work on the day-to-day operations of the court in the sense of focusing on the cases. The fellows, and there are about 4 clerks per justice, the fellows, of which there are 4 for the entire Supreme Court, are more focused on assisting the Supreme Court as a branch, as a political institution, and so we were involved in the operations of the court.
So suppose you had 9 justices in front of you who were the justices who were there while you were there. Currently, there are not 9, but suppose that there were. As we're approaching the end of the podcast, I'd like to ask you this final question. So you're speaking to these 9 justices, and you're telling them why U.S. policy needs to work to prevent future genocides, what the purpose is of, I guess, or maybe we might be in a legal, we may be in a classroom in Yale Law School or in Harvard, and you're talking to your students. Why have you been so involved in trying to advance the public interest through your work on genocides. What do you hope your legacy will be? What do you hope United States legal legacy will be to the world in preventing these atrocities from happening again? So I guess, what would you tell the justices or your students? This is why we ought to care. This is why I care. And this is, at the end of the day, what I hope the United States will leave for the rest of the world in order to prevent these things from happening again.
I think I would start by emphasizing our common humanity. We as in the United States are a nation of immigrants, and many of us have come from, or we have friends and family who remain in deeply troubled countries. Our country itself faces ongoing issues of discrimination, some violently so as well. Mm-hmm. And so when I think of genocide, I think of perhaps the worst manifestation of that. That discrimination could become so egregious that its perpetrators would think that you simply need to eliminate an entire group of people. So the message I would hope to convey is that we must focus on our common humanity, the basic principle of equality and fairness, mm-hmm. And that we must help each other, especially in our greatest times of need. And one thing that I would also say is, but for the grace of God, it might be you in that position. By some coincidence of birth, we are, in the relative security that we find ourselves here speaking today in Washington, D.C., whereas others, by their dint of birth, find themselves in Aleppo, Syria, being attacked incessantly. And I think that we need to, recognize and appreciate our own humility and good fortune, and seek to assist each other where we can.
That has been Zach Kaufman, Senior Fellow at Harvard University School of Government and former United States Supreme Court Fellow, publisher of 3 books, who speaks about the capriciousness of fortune. Genocide is a uniquely human phenomenon, where we target an entire group or part of a group for extermination. Zach stresses that it could really, it's not merit-based who is targeted, who is victimized. In fact, it has happened in the industrialized world, it has happened in the developing world, it's happened in many different parts of the world. And what Zach stresses is a desire to recognize our common humanity. He speaks of personal anecdotes that put a face on the atrocities of a genocide, but also has a pragmatic approach to genocide and its prevention through his legal career. And I think what Zach tries to say is that through his academic career, through his career in Department of State, Department of Justice, and through his burgeoning literary career, that there is a crime of crimes that ought to be prevented as a matter of national security interest, as a matter of human interest, that for Zach, the public interest is one that can be more broadly defined than something that is necessarily immediately happening domestically in the United States. For Zach, he has a world perspective, and with that perspective, he sees it as a responsibility of humanity to look out for these hapless victims of incredibly unfathomable crimes that demonstrate the worst that humanity can do. So Zach is dedicated to advancing the public interest by fighting this scourge of humanity. Zach, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Jordan. It's been an honor.
And this has been episode 136 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Remember to subscribe on publicinterestpodcast.com, listen on iTunes, your podcast app, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Blueberry, Player FM, Facebook, or Twitter. Should you wish to leave a message for Zach, you can call 240-630-0380, and that voicemail will be conveyed to him. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next time.